It is the most powerful explosion ever recorded by a factor of 1,000. It came from literally nowhere, and it was over 3,000 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima. So what could have caused such an insane explosion? Well, in August 1963, the world was thrown into chaos after two massive explosions rocked the remote Siberian wilderness. The first blast was equivalent to around 270 tons of TNT, completely decimating the surrounding area. But what happened next was beyond anything that scientists had ever witnessed before. Less than 3 days later, on September, a second explosion occurred, which dwarfed the first by over 3,000. In fact, this second explosion is officially classified as a 6 on the Richter scale, with a pressure wave that registered all the way in New Zealand, nearly 12,000 kilometers away. But given how remote Siberia is, and the fact that no one had even seen this crater until nearly 40 years later, how did we even discover these massive explosions in the first place? Well, it actually all came down to some pretty amateur sleuthing. You see, these blasts were so incredibly powerful that they were picked up by a local Russian weather station. And a few days after the first explosion, some locals who were working at nearby gold mines reported hearing a loud boom, feeling their buildings shake. And when they went outside, they noticed a bright orange cloud in the sky. However, since the Soviet Union was extremely secretive at the time, they didn't report this to the authorities. Instead, the reports were shelved for decades. That was until a nuclear physicist named Gregory Bortsov started noticing some very peculiar data. He had been studying the atmospheric pressure readings from that fateful day in September, when he noticed a huge spike on the chart. One that shouldn't have been there. When he looked into it further, he discovered the previously classified reports from the local residents and began his own investigation. He tracked down some of those same locales, and they told him what they had seen all those years ago. He then went to the archives and found the original weather reports from 1963, and together with some old KGB documents, the pieces of the puzzle started to fit together, using satellite images. He was able to find the source of the explosion in a remote part of the wilderness known as the Gates to Hell. And after getting permission from the Russian government, he and his team traveled to the site to collect soil samples and measure the radiation levels. What they found was shocking. Not only was the explosion epic in size, but whatever had blown up here had also left behind a radioactive crater. But despite the immense power of this explosion, there was not a single sign of life. There were no animals, no plants, not even any bacteria. It was a complete wasteland. To this day, the crater remains sealed off with special forces guarding it to make sure no one gets too close. And because of the intense levels of radiation, it's impossible to tell exactly what caused the explosion. But scientists believe there are only 3 possibilities. It wasn't a meteorite, and it wasn't a nuclear bomb. But after discovering just how much there was, they realized that this couldn't possibly be the case. Even if every single plant and animal in Siberia were to decay, it wouldn't produce anywhere near enough methane. At some point, either a meteorite or a falling boulder could have struck the surface, puncturing the pocket of methane. As the methane escaped, it rapidly expanded in volume, causing an explosion of epic proportions. Instead, it was a buildup of methane gas. You see, Siberia is home to the largest deposits of methane gas on Earth. This is where methane is produced from non-living things like rocks, hot enough to melt rock and metal. As it expanded, it sucked up tons of dust and debris, before being blown back inwards again. Since methane burns at such a high temperature, it creates an intense fireball that expands and contracts multiple times. The biggest problem is that this explosion not only creates an inferno that incinerates everything in sight, but it also causes an intense tsunami. This includes water, which gets pushed away from the explosion. If it had happened somewhere more populated, it could have been catastrophic. It's a relief that it happened in Siberia and not anywhere else. As the fireball starts to collapse back inwards again, all of that water is then pushed back towards the epicenter of the explosion in the form of a destructive tsunami. Each expansion sucks up more oxygen and fuel, causing the fire to grow larger and larger. This can go on for hours, creating an inferno that can level entire forests. This caused an intense fireball effect, hot enough to incinerate anything that got too close. Over millions of years, inorganic matter can undergo chemical reactions that produce methane gas. The first theory is that it was a meteorite. That's why many experts believe that the cause of the explosion was something radioactive in nature. But what could that be? Meteorites aren't uncommon. In fact, every year, the Earth is hit by thousands of them, but they usually burn up in the atmosphere. They hoped to find traces of plutonium-39, a radioactive element that's only produced in nuclear reactors or weapons. However, they came back empty-handed. And the reason that it hasn't happened since is because of the self-limiting nature of methane. And although the initial explosion was devastating, the real damage was done by the collapsing fireball. There was no sign of any nuclear material whatsoever. Only an estimated 10,000 meteorites land on Earth each year. However, most of them are very small, weighing only a few grams. Once all of the oxygen has been used up, the reaction stops. That's why when a Bunsen burner runs out of gas, the flame goes out. Similarly, the explosion ends as soon as all of the methane has been released. The largest meteorite to ever hit Earth weighed in at over 60,000 tons. And if something like that were to slam into the Earth, it would cause quite the explosion. However, the fact that the explosion was so radioactive makes this theory highly unlikely. Well, the second theory is that it was a nuclear weapon, something that could explain both the explosion and the high levels of radiation. However, Russia has denied that this is the case. They have claimed that no nuclear weapons have ever been detonated in this part of Siberia. And they have conducted several tests to prove it. In 2009, Russian scientists drilled a deep hole into the ground to retrieve samples of the core. This leads us to the third theory, one that many scientists now believe to be true. For years, scientists believed that this methane came from decaying organic matter. So instead, scientists believed that the methane was produced by a different process called abiotic methane. And scientists believed that there was probably a large pocket of this methane that built up under the surface. Whatever the cause, the destruction was catastrophic. All of the trees within a 20-kilometer radius were completely obliterated and sent flying into the air. You see, as the methane rapidly expanded outwards, it formed a massive fireball that reached temperatures of over 2,000 degrees Celsius. And whatever didn't get burned up was completely obliterated by the shockwave. An explosion this powerful should not be taken lightly. You see, when methane burns, it quickly uses up all of the oxygen in the surrounding area. However, the aftermath is where things get really dangerous. But eventually, the oxygen is used up and the fire goes out. As the fireball expands outwards, it pushes everything in its path out of the way. Tsunamis like these have been known to wipe out entire cities. So it's lucky that the explosion occurred in such a remote part of Siberia. And while we may never know for sure what caused this explosion, we do know one thing. Now watch. Biggest volcano eruption in history. Or check out most painful goodbyes. Nature will make you cry.